beginning so far as civilization is concerned. It's certainly, Kemet. I mean, you can speak of Ethiopia, then you have to define Ethiopia in terms of, is it all of Africa? Does Ethiopia include Egypt, or is Ethiopia then Abyssinia, and so on and so forth? But those are details we don't have to discuss at this particular point. I mean, I know what you're saying, and I think everybody knows what you're saying. There needs to be certainly more inclusion of the other civilization, shall we say. They may be derivative, and some may not be derivative. Some may be original in their own right, in a different geographical setting within the continent. Because certainly we know we have a vast continent that, certainly, China, Europe, and America can fit in the continent with a little bit over for Japan. So it's huge, and all of our civilizations didn't necessarily have to start with Nile Valley, or they may have started outside Nile Valley and gotten into Nile Valley, and and may not have been connected to Nile Valley at all. But I think you know this better than I do. But it's important to understand that the studies have to be broad-based in terms of geography and civilization within the continent, and broad-based in terms of not simply looking at history from the perspective of dates and numbers and a straight sort of a timeline, but involving the educational process around our culture and cultural contributions and traditions over time. And you just mentioned something that's extremely important: the whole business of language, and when did writing start? Well, I'm taking you back to Egypt and pyramid texts and so on in terms of 3000 BC, but I think that's also significant to point that out in terms of it being an antecedent by thousands of years in terms of development elsewhere, and being the source of development elsewhere, either because of education, people coming in to educate, or because of migration, and that's significant to understand. Not just the population dynamics of the world, but the intellectual and sociological, I want to say spiritual, and I suppose I should, or as opposed to religious. But if you dig deep at what is behind, let's say, the Hindu religion, you really go back, shall we say, to Vedanta and the Samkhya philosophy, and you go to Buddhism, and you trace that through India, into Tibet, into China, and into Japan, and you see the influence of African thought, because you and I know that Buddha was one of us. All the early images, shall we say, of Buddha, shows him with curly hair or complexion and features and so on and so forth. Later on, of course, Asians added, Asian features, but they kept, the curly hair as being symbolic in most of their images. So, I'm saying in a long-winded way that history, not just history, but the whole world has been turned on its head, upside down. And that's where we are now, because this whole concept of everything started with Greece and with Rome, and following that in terms of a direct timeline, and everything before that is primitive. When you get these definitions of animism, of paganism, of primitivism, and on and on, the derogative statements When the history has been rewritten, and not only the history has been rewritten, but then it has been rewritten with such ignorance, because total lack of understanding, even by so many of the great Egyptologists and so many of these sociologists who have gone to Africa and have supposedly studied, people in the villages or what have you. But they've done all of this from the perspective of ignorance. And I say that because, again, you get back to the European understanding of what is humanly possible. And the only thing they know that's humanly possible is information coming through the five senses, and an intellect then that deals with that information, through logic. And that is the epitome of civilization. That's simply a narrow portion of what reality is. And Africans have always known this, and Africans have always manifested this greater understanding, because there's always been, if you want to call it a sense, you can call it a sixth sense, but there's always been the understanding that we were not different from nature, and we were one with nature. And you go again, it's easiest certainly for me to go back to Kemet and talking about Ausar, and Ausar, being the son of Ra, and this is the identity with God. And Ausar, of course, was the ideal human being from the African perspective. So we are one with our creation. How can you be one with your creation? It's clearly not a physical one. It's a spiritual one. So if you're a spiritual one, then the oneness that you participate in has you have to have access to it, and it has to have access to you. So you get to a unified field as a universal space. And so this is intrinsic to Africa, for 10,000 years. And it's only coming into an understanding of Europe, within the last few years, if you will, 50 years or so. And it's not been integrated into philosophy. It's not been integrated into religion. It's not been integrated into sociology or ethics. So, this is why everything is chaotic, I think, within the European situation. And I'm saying this to say that Africa and Africans need to have that transformation of mindset, and to be able to go back to an understanding. And this is why, again, I validate, shall we say, Kemet, because that's where it was first promulgated. And I think that's, you can see it in some sense in its purest form, if you understand the hieroglyphics and the symbolism. You have to understand the symbolism, and you have to understand the fact that much of what was taught allegorically as the best way to transmit information, certainly in terms of something that was of a spiritual nature and couldn't really be expressed in words, because there's no words for certain things that are beyond the intellect and really related simply to direct experience. So unless we go back to that, and we have to have an understanding that there's a clear difference and a clear division that was primary. I mean, Europeans like to go back to Plato and talk about the cave and so on and so forth, but Plato didn't have the proper understanding of the Kemetic philosophy. And then they go forward again to people like, Plotinus and what have you, and Hermeticism, as if to say those things are Greek and they did not come, from Africa. But then those things also were demonized within Europe, and promulgated those ideas. Again, if they were religious, they were burnt at the stake, or they had to retract. And even if they were scientists, as you know, people like Galileo and so on and so forth, because the religion that developed in Europe, certainly since 325 or whatever, Council of Nicaea, and then later on Chalcedon and what have you, that said, anyone who does not subscribe to our dogma, they're, they should be anathemized, if you will. And you know what that means, meaning destroyed. And that's exactly what they did. They destroyed anybody who did not espouse the dogma and therefore have the faith. And they developed a religion that was based on dogma and faith and externalized with an anthropomorphic conception of God, who was separate from the earth and separate from us as human beings, which is a ridiculous concept. But that is what has made, and you can look the same thing in terms of philosophy. Philosophy should be about wisdom. Now, what is wisdom? Wisdom has to be something that you have experienced in terms of actually knowing. And it certainly has to go back at least to gnosis, Gnosis, which is a direct way of knowing, not an intellectual knowing. Whereas philosophy that has come down to us in terms of the European sense is about the intellect, and it's about speculation, and it's about dialectic argumentation, and it can never discover truth. So you have a philosophy that can't discover truth. You have a religion that does not, you cannot achieve salvation through the religion. You can only achieve salvation through the dogma, and hopefully some external force will help you, such as the Pope or the church, or the confessions, etc., etc. And you're going to get your goodies in the hereafter. I mean, all of those things separate you from yourself, and they're artificial and they're confusing. And I think this is exactly what you see. Europe is confused. I mean, where's the basis for ethics and values when you're committing genocide? How can genocide be right? I mean, there's
Can I jump in there, sir?
it can be right. Yes, please, because I'm getting carried away with myself a little bit.
Yeah, the main issue here is there has been enough work done by enough scholars to put together the counter curriculum that you're talking about. With the work that has been published on Ma'at, with the work that's been published on African spirituality and so on, there's enough to frame it. But what it is people actually putting pen to paper on one hand, and then making it the basis of university curricula on the other hand. That's what will produce the change. And we don't really have an excuse, because if you consider the Portland model stuff was 1989, I seem to remember. That's a long time ago. In other words, we had 40 years to build on that material, 40 years to take that material. And this material is available for free online, So it's a situation where the transformation of what is taught to our next generation, we've had an opportunity. We haven't used that opportunity. We haven't exploited that opportunity. And what I'm calling on is for the Pan-African community, the conscious community, whatever term they want to use, to avail themselves of this information to make the kind of intellectual changes that you're talking about, so that we don't get into this, but what the Europeans teach is wrong. What the Europeans teach is wrong. What the European teach is wrong. No, this is what we're teaching. And we have to empower ourselves to do this, because as I've said before, Black history is interesting. Black studies is revolutionary. You see, once you can change the teaching of all the subjects, you now have intellectual revolution.